It's a great pleasure for us to be here to present what has been our experience in the labeling of buildings as well. As our colleague mentioned, we also have here a large share of our energy consumption is due to buildings, about 1/3, a little bit more than 1/3 of the energy consumption in Portugal is on buildings. So it's this is a tool that is very important to address energy efficiency on that respect. And I'll start by just giving you a quick overview. What is our let me see if this is here. Are we here in terms of demographics and the built environment? That relates to the built environment. We are about 10 million here in Portugal. The tendency is to decrease, unfortunately. We are getting older and not that many young people, so we expect to be a little bit less in 2050. But these 10 million people live in 3.5 million buildings here in Portugal, which obviously have buildings which are single-family houses, which is the majority of the built environment here. About 90%, 87% of buildings are single-family houses, and 13% are multi-family houses. But in terms of population, we actually are quite spread, and half of the people live in households and in single-family houses, and the other half in multi-family houses. So it's a large number of buildings we have. Only 4 million of the buildings are actually occupied. About 1/3 of them are second houses or vacant. So this clears or shows the kind of universe we are talking about when we want to improve energy efficiency of this building stock. And what has been the history regarding this sector? Well, in terms of energy efficiency, until 1990, we had no energy requirements in our legislation. So that was when 3.8 million buildings were actually constructed. So most of our building stock didn't have any kind of energy requirements when it was built. Only in 2009, in the 90s, we only had the first regulation, which is not quite well turned to energy efficiency. It was more on pathology prevention. So we had more than 10 years of a simple regulation that addressed the pathology issues, and a lot of buildings were built on that during that time as well. Only in 2006 we had the first actual regulation that was pretty much turned into energy efficiency. It was a consequence of the European directive and really made a change. But you see here, it didn't affect that many new buildings. So we have 95% of our households or our building stock was built prior to energy efficiency requirements. That turns to be quite a challenge, because if you want to turn this building stock into a more efficient one, we have a lot of work ahead of us. Only a small part, almost about 300,000 buildings were built under energy efficient requirements, well established. So what has been this path of legislative path that we have been going through? It has followed what has been the European directive, which was first issued in 2002. It set the framework for all member states in the European Union to change the legislation to adapt to these requirements. It has been revised every 8 years, more or less. The last revision of the directive was in 2018. And we, in Portugal, we have adapted to the directive, and we have transposed this directive into the national regulation in a few steps. The first one was in 2006, where we had the first 3 decree laws that did this transposition. Most of the issues were technical. We had a calculation methodology that followed more or less European standards. Minimum requirements were set in terms of quality of the elements that were built. There was a clear focus on new buildings and renovations. So it was the initial aspect of the directive was very much focused on that. And also it introduced for the first time the energy certificates or energy labels, as well as qualified experts or professionals that were trained specifically to address the issues of energy efficiency, energy certification of buildings. Following the second directive, we also updated our legislation, another decree law, which brought us to another level. The requirements were adapted to a more cost-optimal standard. It was introduced the first time, the nearly zero energy buildings, a concept that is now fully in place throughout the European Union, and also here. There was an additional focus on existing buildings. It was clear for all Europe that that's the problem we have to tackle is the existing buildings, not so much new one, because new construction is not that big as it is. Display of energy certificates and also some other issues related to some incentives and barriers that didn't allow, well, should be improved to allow a more stronger focus on energy efficiency. And finally, in 2020, just 1 year ago, more or less, we actually published a new revision, another decree law, which was clearly focused on existing buildings and turning buildings smarter. Renovation strategy, we had to put in place a renovation strategy for 2050 to address the existing building stock, going for electric mobility as well, the integration of electric mobility in the buildings, automation and control of energy systems, having a smart readiness indicator as well is an option, but this is making his way through all member states as well, and also the aspect related to inspection, installation of equipment, and also having a clear link between financial support and in energy efficiency. So this basically paves the road to what we are at this stage. And we show here in a very schematic way what has this done in terms of actually energy consumption in the buildings in a very simple way. If we had no requirements, we had a lot of consumption at the beginning, and then we start shifting as legislation went into force to buildings that were less energy consumption, but also at the same time an increasing amount of renewable energy being used there, and that has been slowly upgraded, and we are now at the nearly zero energy building standard, where buildings must be constructed to have as less energy consumption as possible and have as much energy supplied from renewables as possible as well. So we are now going into this new standard. In terms of legal requirements, what we have so far, we also have requirements for, well, in this case, for both residential and non-residential buildings, for walls and roofs, windows, ventilation systems. Well, more or less what you also mentioned in your thermal regulations. Also have something about lifts and electric charging infrastructure as well. And also all buildings have to comply with energy performance requirements. But if we look at residential buildings, we now have a thermal comfort requirement as well, which is interesting, is due to be implemented shortly. And non-residential buildings also have requirements for lighting systems and also for building automation and control systems. So this is basically the framework, the requirements framework that we have for both types of buildings. And besides having technical requirements, we also have design, installation, and adjustment requirements. So these systems are actually well designed and well installed to achieve maximum efficiency throughout its lifetime. Other obligations that we have in legislation relates to having the installation and maintenance of the technical systems in buildings, having a clear documentation of these systems as well, having a periodic evaluation and consumption monitoring. This is basically for non-residential buildings, large ones, having building automation and control systems, electric mobility and inspections, and also some provisions on indoor air quality that needs to be evaluated annually to allow that occupants, or to show that occupants are living in a healthy environment. Well, but the real game changer of all this legislation has been the energy performance certificates. Besides having these requirements in place, the energy performance certificates are actually the ones that led to a real compliance to these requirements. They are mandatory. It's a mandatory scheme since 2009, since the early stages of the PPD transposition in Portugal. As in your case, it's a way to actually check if the minimum requirements for new buildings were met. So only if you have met these minimum requirements, you are allowed to issue a certificate, and that really pushes the whole chain of professionals to come to standards. Also, in existing buildings, it allows, and all buildings actually, it allows the evaluation of energy performance. So we have it as a scale from F to A+, and it rates, and it allows us to communicate very simply with the consumer, which is the key aspect of the certificate. Another key aspect is to have information on potential improvement measures that are in existing buildings. What can people do to improve the performance of the buildings? There are also some public display of the certificates in non-residential buildings, and that really makes a difference to people to be aware of what is the performance of the buildings and brings this energy efficiency issue to the life of the common citizens. And having this in place has allowed us to collect a lot of information. We are now at this stage where we are able to bring our buildings what we call under the APC microscope. We have more than 2 million certificates issued so far, which is about 1/3 of the building stock. We are more than 12 years of certificates in place, so we have this amount of certificates already issued. It allows us not only to color each house according to the scale, but also to know a lot about each house. About 200 data points is collected for each house, going to very small details indeed. We have done this with more than 2,000 qualified experts that we have trained and qualified to issue the certificates. So they go to training, and they have they are the ones that are in charge of checking the minimum requirements in new buildings and rating the existing buildings as well. And this work has also allowed us to identify more than 3.5 million energy efficiency improvement measures in these houses that are already certified, existing houses. So a lot can be done to improve this house, and also the average investment for improving each house has also been estimated for residential houses. If 8.5 thousand euros per certificate is invested, we can upgrade the house to a nice standard. And non-residential buildings, it's a little bit higher, but also we have this figure. So it allows us to see what needs to be spent to lead the buildings to a good standard. It also allowed us to see and have a clear picture in terms of performance of buildings. The average label or the average glass of which in each district here in Portugal is depicted here, and we can see that before the 90s there were actually very poor houses, but once we had legislation in place, the landscape became much more greener. So it allows us to monitor the progress in terms of how the legislation has caused an effect in terms of houses that were built, in terms of era construction. And it allows us also to go into, as I said, going very, very deep. We can have a clear picture of what is the average U value, for instance, for walls and also for windows, for and other parameters that are characteristics that are used to compute the building's performance, energy performance. So we can have access to this kind of information into this level of detail, which is quite interesting, quite relevant to conduct some analysis. But overall, what we are interested to know is how can we improve the existing building stock, which only has 10% of buildings with high efficiency buildings, with rates A+. How can we improve the other part, the 3/4 of the existing buildings? And certificates also allow us to see that we can change walls and roofs. So most of the opportunities are about 50% are on the building's envelope. And also we can go for hot water system, heating systems, and those are also opportunities that we can use to improve the performance of houses. So this is quite relevant information that if in theory, we could implement all these improvement measures that were identified in certificates, if we could implement them just by a word of magic or something, that would mean that we could put the country much greener in terms of energy performance, and would allow us to save up to 1 billion euros per year in terms of energy bills. So it's an estimate. Obviously, it's a potential. It's not feasible, obviously, fully feasible, but it shows that the path and what can be done. So this is how APCs are being used at this stage. What's next? Well, they are a tool that is well known at this stage in Portugal, but they will have additional features like having here the real energy consumption, not all, because this is computed in terms of standard conditions, so to allow a comparison between buildings, but we can add information about real energy consumption in the certificate as well. Going for water efficiency performance indicators is also another issue that we are dealing here. Materials use performance indicators, and finally having what I mentioned already, that is referred in the directive, the smart readiness indicator, having that as well alongside with the certificate. So it's let's say it's a starting point, but we are planning to add all these additional aspects to increase the value of the certificate as well.